Welcome, Night Owl. I'm glad you've joined me for tonight's relaxing yet informative tales from the past to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. As we dive into the lives of the most infamous and tyrannical medieval kings in history, get cozy, settle in, and let me take you on a journey back in time. Feel free to share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. If you enjoy this style of calm historical storytelling, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Tonight, we'll be exploring the lives and legacies of some of medieval history's most notorious monarchs, kings whose reigns were marred by cruelty, instability, or bizarre behavior. Through their stories, we'll delve into the complexities of power, the impact of mental illness, and the lasting impressions these rulers left on their kingdoms and the world. Our first stop is 14th century France, where we'll meet a king whose reign began with such promise but descended into chaos and turmoil as madness took hold of his mind. Charles VI of France was just 11 years old when he ascended to the throne in 1380. The early years of his reign were filled with hope and affection from his subjects, who dubbed him Charles the Beloved. Young and energetic, he was known for his chivalry, charm, and grand festivities. The future of France seemed bright under his rule. But on a fateful winter night in 1393, the course of Charles's life and kingship would change forever. The king and a group of nobles were gathered for a masquerade ball at the royal palace. The men, including Charles, were dressed as wild men, clad in costumes of linen, soaked with resinous wax or pitch, to which flax was attached to give the appearance of savages. As the dancing began, disaster struck. In a reckless moment, the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, brought a torch too close to the dancers. The highly flammable costumes instantly ignited, engulfing the men in flames. Chaos and screams filled the hall. The Duchess of Berry hurled her robe over the king, saving his life, but 4 of the noblemen were badly burned and died in agony days later. Charles escaped physical injury, but the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, as it came to be known, left deep psychological scars. In the months that followed, the king began to show signs of mental distress and instability. It was whispered that he had gone mad from the shock. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. At times, he would rush wildly through the corridors of the palace, howling like a wolf and insisting he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. He would often forget his name and title, not recognizing his wife or children. Once, he became so convinced he was St. George that he had the royal arms changed accordingly. For months on end, he refused to bathe, change his clothes, cut his hair, or nails. Courtiers described with pity and revulsion how he would go about in tattered, vermin-infested robes, his hair matted and filthy. In his lucid moments, Charles was gentle and melancholy, deeply distressed by his own condition. But these periods of clarity grew rarer as his illness progressed. As Charles descended further into madness, France began to crumble around him. Seeing the king incapacitated, rival factions seized the opportunity to advance their own agendas, maneuvering to control the crown. The king's periods of insanity created a power vacuum and a crisis of leadership that destabilized the entire kingdom. The decades of Charles's reign were marked by increasing turmoil both at home and abroad. Ambitious nobles and relatives of the king vied for power and influence, their infighting fracturing the country. Meanwhile, England seized on France's weakness to press its claims to the French throne, reigniting the 100 Years' War. Through it all, Charles drifted in and out of lucidity, a king in name but not in faculty. When sensible, he tried to fulfill his royal duties and bring stability to his fractured kingdom, but these moments grew briefer and rarer. More often, he spent his days in a pitiful state, unable to rule, unable to comprehend his own condition. There are poignant stories of the mad king's gentler moments. Once, during a brief respite from his illness, Charles encountered one of his old friends, a knight he hadn't seen in years. Surprised to see him at court, Charles asked why he had come. With tears in his eyes, the old knight replied, "To see you, my king, for it has been long since I last did." Charles embraced him with affection and wept, saying, "Good sir, you are indeed one of my loyal knights and friends. Stay with me, for you are most welcome." For just a moment, the king had surfaced from the depths of his madness, lucid and touched by this display of love and loyalty. But such moments were fleeting. As the years went on, Charles grew more withdrawn and isolated, lost in the labyrinth of his own failing mind. By the end of his life, he was a shell of the vibrant young man who had once been the promising hope of France. When he finally succumbed to a bout of dysentery in 1422, his son, Charles VII, had already begun to rule in his stead. The reign of Charles VI, begun with such hope and promise, ended in sorrow and disarray. The king, whom the people had once loved so ardently, spent his final years a broken man, sometimes pitiful, sometimes terrifying, in the grip of his delusions. His sad fate demonstrates how much the fortunes of a nation could turn on the stability of a ruler's mind in an age where kings wielded absolute but often fragile power. From one troubled king, we now journey across the Channel to England and another monarch whose reign was marred by mental illness. Like Charles, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and scholarly in nature, but also like his French counterpart, he would find the pressures of kingship too much to bear, with devastating consequences for his realm. Henry's reign was troubled from the start, for he inherited the throne as an infant, just 9 months old, far too young to rule in his own right. Regents ruled in his name while rival factions plotted to control the child king, hoping to dominate the kingdom through him. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a ferocious struggle for power between the king's ambitious relatives and advisors. Even as a youth, Henry was more inclined towards religion and learning than the arts of war and statecraft expected of a king. Deeply devout, he took pleasure in daily attendance at Mass and devoted many hours to prayer and contemplation. He was also a keen scholar with a love of reading and an interest in education. Henry would go on to found 2 of England's most venerable institutions of learning, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. But while Henry's gentle nature earned him affection, it left him ill-equipped for the power struggles and political machinations that swirled around the throne. As he came of age and assumed his full royal duties, he floundered in his attempts to control the squabbling factions and bring unity to his kingdom. The greatest blow to Henry's reign came in August 1453, when the king suddenly fell into an inert stupor, unable to speak, recognize anyone, or respond to any stimuli. For more than a year, he remained in this vegetative state, not even reacting to the birth of his own son and heir. As with his grandfather, Charles VI of France, whom he resembled in both character and fate, Henry's mysterious illness thrust his kingdom into turmoil. With the king incapacitated, old feuds and rivalries erupted into open conflict. The simmering resentment between the houses of Lancaster and York, 2 cadet branches of the Plantagenet royal house, now boiled over into outright war. This struggle would become known as the Wars of the Roses, after the red and white rose emblems of Lancaster and York. Even when Henry briefly emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he struggled to reassert control over the chaotic political scene. By 1455, the Yorkists felt bold enough to take up arms against the king's Lancastrian supporters, defeating them at the First Battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured by the Yorkists and forced to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In the years that followed, England descended into a state of intermittent civil war, with the hapless Henry shunted back and forth between the warring factions. Whenever the king lapsed back into one of his periods of insensibility, fresh fighting would break out as each side tried to secure control of his person, and with it, the legitimacy of rule. During his bouts of madness, Henry's behavior was pitiful and childlike. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like an infant. The once keen scholar now took no pleasure in his books and papers. He gave no sign of recognizing his own wife and son. To most observers, the king seemed utterly lost within himself, an empty vessel stripped of will and sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancastrian support in 1470, but by this point he was a king in name only, a feeble puppet controlled by his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the ruthless Earl of Warwick. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back, capturing Henry and forcing him to abdicate in favor of the Yorkist King Edward IV. The sad final chapter of Henry's life unfolded within the confines of the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by King Edward. There, abandoned by his allies and bereft of his crown, Henry's already fragile grasp on reality disintegrated completely. When informed of the death of his young son at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he reportedly showed no reaction, lost in the midst of his own shattered mind. Just a few days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was dead, found lifeless in his chamber under mysterious circumstances. While the official account claimed he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, many contemporary observers suspected foul play, with the finger of blame pointed squarely at the Yorkist king. And so ended the tragic life of Henry VI, a king perhaps too gentle and good for the ruthless times into which he was born. His decades of misrule, punctuated by devastating bouts of mental illness, fractured the royal dynasty and plunged England into one of its darkest chapters. Like Charles the Mad across the Channel, Henry's sad fate demonstrates the immense impact that a monarch's mental state could have on the fortunes of an entire nation. From England, we now travel north to Scandinavia to meet another 16th century ruler whose promising reign was derailed by paranoia and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden had all the makings of a strong monarch. He was well-educated, cultured, and charismatic. But like Charles and Henry before him, he would succumb to mental illness, with disastrous consequences for his kingdom. Eric ascended to the Swedish throne in 1560 after the death of his formidable father, Gustav I. He inherited a strong centralized state and initially proved himself a capable ruler. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, an accomplished scholar, poet, and composer. But even amid the festivities of his splendid coronation, there were hints of the erratic behavior and delusions that would later consume him. As his reign progressed, Eric grew increasingly suspicious and paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies all around him. He became convinced that his own nobles and the aristocracy of neighboring Denmark and Poland were plotting to overthrow him and steal his crown. These fears were fanned by his chief advisor, Karen Persson, who exploited the king's fragile mental state to eliminate his own political enemies. Eric's personal life was equally tumultuous. Early in his reign, he fell passionately in love with Karen Mansdotter, a beautiful commoner who had been a maid in the royal household. Against all convention and the admonitions of his advisors, Eric secretly married Karen in 1567 and had her crowned as queen. While the marriage caused a scandal, Karen would prove a stabilizing influence, remaining loyal to Eric even during his darkest days. The defining moment of Eric's reign came in 1567 with the infamous Stour murders. Convinced that the Stour noble family and their allies were plotting against him, Eric had several members of the family imprisoned and brought to trial on trumped-up charges. In a fit of rage and paranoia, the king himself stabbed and killed one of the nobles, Niels Stour, during an interrogation. 2 other Stour lords and several of their associates were subsequently executed on Eric's orders. The Stour murders shocked the nation and turned sentiment against the increasingly unstable king. Eric's behavior grew more erratic and delusional. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult, convinced he could read the future in the stars. He would have bouts of wild, manic energy, alternating with periods of deep melancholy. At times, he fancied himself a god, demanding his courtiers worship him. As opposition to Eric's rule mounted, his own brothers, John and Charles, seized the opportunity to move against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Eric, forcing him to abdicate in favor of John III. The coup was supported by most of the Swedish nobility, alienated by the king's tyranny and madness. Eric's final years were marked by tragedy and increasing mental deterioration. Imprisoned in a succession of castles by his brother, the deposed king descended deeper into insanity. He became convinced he was not Eric XIV at all, but a different man altogether. His devoted wife Karen remained with him in captivity, the only person who could soothe him in his agitated states. In 1577, after almost a decade in confinement, the 43-year-old Eric died, likely poisoned on the orders of his brother. He was buried hastily and without ceremony, for John III, the mad brother, represented an uncomfortable reminder of the fragility of royal power and the ever-present danger of succession crises. Eric XIV's story represents a tragic waste of potential. He was a gifted man, educated and cultured, who held such promise as a ruler, but like many monarchs, he found himself unequal to the immense stresses and paranoias of kingship. His unraveling mind led him down a path of tyranny and terror that undid his achievements and ruptured the kingdom. Traveling further east to Russia, we come to the dark tale of another ruler undone by paranoia and crippling mental illness. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially assume the title of Tsar of all Russia. His nearly 40-year reign would transform Russia, but also unleash a whirlwind of madness and brutality upon his realm. Ivan's early life was scarred by tragedy, struggle, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. He lost both his parents by the age of 8 and grew up in the shadow of ambitious nobles and relatives who fought to control the regency. The young Ivan learned to fear for his life and saw enemies and conspiracies everywhere. These early experiences laid the groundwork for the paranoia and ruthlessness that would define his later reign. When Ivan reached adulthood and took full power in 1547, he quickly set about consolidating control over the fractious boyar nobility. Talented and energetic, he scored a series of impressive military victories over Russia's enemies, expanding the boundaries of his state. He launched a series of popular reforms, revising the legal code and convoking Russia's first parliament. Thanks to these successes, the early part of Ivan's reign was marked by relative stability and progress. But as the years passed, Ivan grew increasingly erratic, suspicious, and violent. He became convinced that the boyars were plotting against him, determined to thwart his agenda and usurp his power. His simmering resentment boiled over in 1565 when he abruptly left Moscow in a fit of rage, threatening to abdicate. In a clever power play, Ivan agreed to return only if he was granted absolute authority to punish traitors and enemies of the state as he saw fit. Cowed, the boyars agreed. Upon his return, Ivan set about terrorizing the nobility, confiscating their lands and executing or exiling those he mistrusted. To enforce his will, he created the oprichniki, a brutal corps of secret police fanatically loyal to him alone. In the following years, Ivan earned his moniker of the Terrible as he unleashed a reign of terror upon Russia. Fueled by paranoia and sadistic impulse, he inflicted cruel punishments on anyone he suspected of treachery. Torture, public executions, and mass killings became commonplace. He even destroyed entire noble families, towns, and the city of Novgorod to root out alleged conspiracies against him. The later period of Ivan's reign also saw a tragic upheaval in his personal life that would push him further into madness and savagery. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. Enraged, his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, engaged in a fierce shouting match with his father. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into an incoherent rampage, alternately praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. The loss of his son and heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic disaster for Russia. His remaining sons were unfit to rule, the middle son an invalid from birth, the youngest a depraved man. As we delve further into the stories of medieval monarchs, whose reigns were plagued by madness, we turn our gaze eastward to the vast expanse of Russia. Here we find a king whose legacy is as complex as it is brutal. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known by his infamous moniker Ivan the Terrible, born in 1530, had an early life marked by tragedy and turmoil. He was just 3 years old when his father Vasily III died from an abscess and inflammation on his leg. His mother, Helena Glinskaya, acted as his regent, but she too passed away when Ivan was only 8, likely a victim of poison. These untimely deaths left young Ivan an orphan, and the court erupted into a maelstrom of power struggles between rival boyar families, each vying for control over the young ruler. Imagine for a moment the fear and isolation young Ivan must have felt, alone in a court seething with hidden agendas and shadowy machinations. As a child, he was often neglected, left to wander the palace halls with only his younger brother for companionship. It's said that the boyars who were supposed to care for him instead mocked and terrorized the young princes, even going so far as to let them go hungry. These early experiences undoubtedly shaped Ivan, planting the seeds of mistrust and paranoia that would bloom darkly in his later years. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Ivan grew into a precocious and determined youth. By the age of 16, he was already a force to be reckoned with. In a dramatic display of his budding authority, he ordered the arrest of Andrei Shaisky, the head of the boyars. Shaisky was dragged from the palace, beaten, and thrown into a dungeon where he was torn apart by hungry dogs, a gruesome sign of the brutality that would come to define Ivan's reign. But Ivan's early years weren't all darkness and brutality. In 1547, at the tender age of 16, he was crowned Tsar of all the Russias, the first to bear this grand title. His coronation was a magnificent affair, a dazzling display of pomp and ceremony that firmly established his authority. That same year, he married his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, a woman he seems to have truly loved. For a time, it seemed as though Ivan's reign might be a bright one, filled with promise and potential. And indeed, Ivan's early rule saw many successes. He implemented a number of popular reforms, revising the law code, limiting the power of the boyars, and even establishing a system of local self-government. He also convened the first Zemsky Sober, or Assembly of the Land, which brought together representatives from across Russia to discuss matters of state. These early reforms earned Ivan widespread support and admiration from his subjects. But perhaps Ivan's greatest achievements in these early years were on the battlefield. He led his armies to victory against the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, annexing vast swaths of territory along the Volga River and expanding Russia's borders to the Caspian Sea. These victories were celebrated throughout the land, and Ivan was hailed as a hero, a conquering Tsar who had brought glory to Russia. But even as Ivan basked in the glow of these triumphs, darker currents were swirling beneath the surface. In 1553, Ivan fell seriously ill, and the court once again descended into chaos as various factions jockeyed for position, anticipating the Tsar's death. Ivan recovered, but his brush with mortality seems to have deeply affected him. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, seeing threats and conspiracies at every turn. These fears were only compounded by the sudden death of his beloved wife, Anastasia, in 1560. Ivan was convinced that she had been poisoned by his enemies, particularly the boyars he had long distrusted. In his grief and paranoia, Ivan's rule took a dark and violent turn. He lashed out at those he perceived as threats, real or imagined. Boyars were arrested, tortured, and executed on the slightest pretense. Ivan's wrath even extended to entire cities. In 1570, he sacked the city of Novgorod, convinced that its inhabitants were plotting against him. Thousands were massacred in a brutal display of the Tsar's unrestrained fury. Perhaps the most chilling embodiment of Ivan's descent into tyranny was the creation of the oprichniki, his infamous secret police force. Clad all in black and riding black horses, the oprichniki became a terrifying symbol of the Tsar's unbridled power. They answered only to Ivan, carrying out his every command with ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty. Under the iron fist of the oprichniki, Russia descended into a reign of terror. Boyars were hunted down and murdered, their estates confiscated and handed over to Ivan's cronies. Even the church wasn't safe. Ivan had the Metropolitan of Moscow, Philip II, arrested and eventually killed for daring to criticize the oprichniki's excesses. As Ivan's paranoia and cruelty spiraled out of control, Russia itself began to unravel. The economy, already strained by Ivan's costly wars, was further burdened by the oprichniki's predations. Fields went untended as peasants fled the countryside to escape the secret police's brutality. Famine and disease followed, stalking the land like grim specters. But perhaps the darkest moment of Ivan's reign was a deeply personal tragedy. In 1581, during a heated argument, Ivan struck his daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. Enraged, his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, engaged in a fierce shouting match with his father. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, Ivan the Terrible struck his son in the head with his iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into an incoherent rampage, alternately praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. The loss of his son and heir represented not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic disaster for Russia. His remaining sons were unfit to rule, the middle son an invalid from birth, the youngest a depraved man. As the specter of Ivan the Terrible fades into the darkness, we find ourselves once again adrift in the mists of history, our journey not yet complete. For the annals of the Middle Ages are filled with tales of kings whose eccentricities and afflictions set them apart from their peers. Some ruled from the shadows, their quirks talked about only in whispers. Others wore their peculiarities openly, leaving a mark as indelible as it was bizarre. Let us first turn our gaze to the court of Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, Hungary, and Croatia. Born in 1552, Rudolf was a man of esoteric tastes, more at home among the beakers and tomes of his alchemical laboratories than in the halls of power. He was a great patron of the arts and sciences, filling his court with a menagerie of scholars, artists, and astronomers, including the great Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. But even as Rudolf cultivated an air of Renaissance enlightenment, a strange malady took root in his mind. The king became convinced that he was made of glass, fragile, and brittle. He refused to allow people to touch him, and even took to wearing thick padded clothing to protect his delicate form. One can almost picture him moving gingerly through his chambers, a phantom king as insubstantial as the spirits he sought to conjure in his alchemical experiments. Rudolf's obsession with the occult and his growing reclusiveness began to take its toll on his kingdom. He neglected the affairs of state, allowing tensions to simmer and the coffers to run dry. In the end, his own family turned against him. In 1611, Rudolf's brother Matthias deposed him, leaving the once great patron of the arts to live out his final months in isolation, haunted by the specters of his own mind. Across the continent, in the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire, we find another ruler undone by madness. Justin II, who reigned from 565 to 578, began his rule with vigor and ambition. But as the years wore on, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was prone to fits of manic laughter and sudden bursts of rage. He imagined himself in direct communication with the angel Gabriel, and would often be found deep in conversation with the empty air. As Justin's delusions deepened, the business of governing fell to his wife, the Empress Sophia. But even her steady hand could not entirely stem the tide of chaos that Justin's madness unleashed. The empire's enemies, sensing weakness, pressed in from all sides. By the time Justin finally succumbed to his afflictions and abdicated the throne, the stage was set for years of tumult and decline. But perhaps no king better embodies the idea of monarchy, undone by inbreeding and affliction, than Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, Charles was the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage, a dynasty more tangled than a thicket of brambles. His tongue was so large he could barely speak or chew. His jaw jutted out so far he struggled to chew his food. And beneath it all lurked a profound mental disability that left him utterly unequipped for the rigors of kingship. Charles's reign was one of unrelenting decline for the once great Spanish Empire. Unable to produce an heir, Charles left his kingdom to be carved up by his rival neighbors upon his death. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, he was a king more to be pitied than reviled, a sad epitaph for a dynasty that had once been the envy of Europe. And so our journey through the gallery of mad monarchs comes to a close. From the glass delusions of Rudolf II to the inbred agonies of Charles II, these kings remind us of the strange twists that fate can take when power and affliction collide. Their stories are a testament to the sometimes gossamer boundary between greatness and insanity and the heavy toll that the crown can take on even the most prepared of minds. But as we let these tales drift into the realm of dreams, let us also remember the humanity behind the history. These were not just kings, but men burdened with the weight of nations, men struggling with demons both internal and external. In the flickering candlelight of the past, their shadows loom large, but their sorrows, too, are writ in time. And so, dear listener, as the veil of sleep descends, let these stories be a gentle reminder of the complexities of power and the fragility of the human mind. May you drift off to the whispers of ages past, secure in the knowledge that, for all their faults and foibles, these kings, too, were once as real as the breath in your lungs and the dreams in your head. Good night, and may the lessons of history guide you gently into the land of Nod. As we explored in our last segment, mental illness could have a profound impact on the reigns of medieval kings, often with tragic consequences for both the monarch and their realm. But madness was not the only trait that could make for a disastrous ruler. Cruelty, pettiness, and plain incompetence also had their place in the rogues' gallery of medieval monarchs. One king who combined several of these unfortunate qualities was John, King of England from 1199 to 1216. The youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John was never expected to inherit the throne. But after the death of his elder brother, Richard the Lionheart, John found himself wearing the crown, and from the start he seemed singularly unfit for the role. John had a talent for making enemies and alienating allies. He was notoriously cruel and petty, once ordering the capture of a particularly bothersome archdeacon and having him pressed to death under weights. He also had a habit of seducing, or some say assaulting, the wives and daughters of his barons, a pastime that won him few friends among the nobility. But it was John's bungling of the war with France that truly earned him infamy. Through a series of military blunders and diplomatic missteps, John managed to lose most of England's territory on the continent, including the ancestral lands of Normandy and Anjou. This was a devastating blow to the prestige and coffers of the English crown. Back home, John's heavy-handed attempts to raise funds and quash opposition only brought more turmoil. He was constantly at odds with his barons in the church. His clumsy attempts to install his own archbishop led Pope Innocent III to place England under a crushing interdict, suspending religious rights across the country. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1215 when a group of rebel barons took up arms against the king. Hopelessly outnumbered, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a charter of liberties that placed limits on the power of the crown. Though John almost immediately reneged on the deal, the Magna Carta would become a cornerstone of English law and a symbol of the fight against tyranny. But John's story doesn't end there. Determined to retake his lost lands in France, John launched a new campaign across the Channel. It was there, while pillaging his way through the Loire Valley, that John contracted dysentery. The evil, as one contemporary put it, would be the end of him. John died a miserable death, his body racked with fever and his bowels turning to water. It was an ignominious end for a king whose reign had brought England to the brink of ruin. John's failures as a ruler were manifold. He was cruel, reckless, and woefully inept at the art of kingship. Yet, in a strange twist of fate, it was his very incompetence that led to the signing of the Magna Carta, a document that would shape the course of English history and inspire the cause of liberty for centuries to come. As we bid good night to bad King John, we're left to ponder the capricious nature of history. A terrible king, through his own failings, inadvertently planted the seeds of something great. It's a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of the past, there are glimmers of hope and progress. And with that thought, we'll let the sands of time carry us gently off to sleep. Speaking of dark chapters, the next king in our gallery of rogues is a figure cloaked in sinister legend. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, is better known to history by his ominous nickname, Vlad the Impaler. His story takes us to the blood-soaked borderlands of Eastern Europe in the 15th century. Vlad was born into a noble family in Wallachia, a principality sandwiched between the Christian kingdoms of Hungary and Poland and the expanding Ottoman Empire. It was a precarious position, and one that required a ruler as ruthless as the enemies at his borders. In Vlad, Wallachia found a prince who was more than up to the task. From an early age, Vlad had known violence and brutality. As a child, he and his younger brother, Radu, were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court, a common practice at the time to ensure the loyalty of vassal states. There, witnessed firsthand the cruelty and casual bloodshed that was a part of Ottoman statecraft. When Vlad finally took the throne of Wallachia in 1456, he was determined to rule with an iron fist. He saw threats all around him, from the Ottomans, from rival noble families, and from anyone who dared to challenge his authority. And he met these threats with a singular brand of brutality that would make him a legend. Vlad's preferred method of execution was impalement, a slow, agonizing death that involved driving a sharpened stake through the victim's body. It was a punishment he meted out with terrifying enthusiasm, sometimes impaling hundreds or even thousands at a time. The sight of Vlad's so-called forests of impaled corpses became a grim warning to any who would cross him. But Vlad's cruelty wasn't just a means to an end. It seemed to be a perverse source of pleasure for him. He reportedly dined among his impaled victims, dipping his bread in their blood. He once had a group of beggars locked in a banquet hall and burned alive, saying he was freeing them from their misery. Even by the brutal standards of the time, Vlad's sadism was shocking. Yet, for all his cruelty, Vlad was also a shrewd and capable ruler. He was a skilled warrior who won several key victories against the Ottomans and worked to strengthen Wallachia's defenses and centralize his own power. In a region beset by foreign invaders and internal strife, Vlad managed to keep Wallachia independent and secure, albeit at a terrible cost. Vlad's bloody reign finally came to an end in 1476, when he was killed in battle against the Ottomans. His head, so the story goes, was cut off and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. But even in death, Vlad's dark legend only grew. In the centuries that followed, he would become a figure of folklore and fantasy, the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula and countless other tales of horror. As we let the grim saga of Vlad the Impaler fade into the shadows of history, we're left to contemplate the nature of evil and the thin line between cruelty and necessity in a time and place where violence was often the only currency of power. Vlad used it with a singular brutality that still has the power to shock and horrify us today. Yet his story also reminds us of the complex web of circumstances that can shape a tyrant. The harsh realities of a dangerous world, the traumas of a violent upbringing, the heavy burdens of rulership. With those sobering thoughts, we'll let the ghosts of the past recede into the mists of time and allow ourselves to drift into a hopefully more peaceful slumber. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than the bloody nightmares of history. As we've seen, Ivan the Terrible's reign was a tumultuous and tragic chapter in Russian history. His early promise as a strong reforming ruler gave way to paranoia, cruelty, and tyranny in his later years. The loss of his beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, seemed to unbalance Ivan, and he grew increasingly unstable and violent. The story goes that in 1565, Ivan formed the Oprichniki, his own loyal band of secret police. Dressed in black and riding black horses, they carried out Ivan's will, terrorizing boyars and peasants alike, confiscating land and wealth for the Tsar. Towns that displeased Ivan, like Novgorod, were sacked mercilessly, the inhabitants tortured and killed in brutal purges. Most tragically of all, in 1581, Ivan's violent temper turned on his own family. The Tsar attacked his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about it, Ivan struck him on the head with his scepter in a fit of rage. The blow proved fatal. The young Tsarevich died a few days later, leaving Ivan shattered with remorse. The Tsar's physical and mental health declined sharply in his later years. He grew increasingly sick, suffering from excruciating pain and uncontrollable rages. Some historians believe he may have been poisoned, perhaps by one of the many enemies he had made. Isolated and paranoid, Ivan continued to lash out even as his body weakened. According to legend, on March 18, 1584, Ivan was sitting down to a game of chess when he suddenly fell ill. The Tsar slumped over onto the chessboard, scattering the pieces onto the floor. Despite the best efforts of his doctors, he never regained consciousness. Ivan the Terrible, Tsar of all Russia, was dead at the age of 53. Ivan IV left behind a complicated legacy. He had expanded Russia's borders, strengthened the position of the Tsar, and instituted popular reforms in his early years. But his later descent into cruelty and madness cast a long shadow. The trauma of the Oprichnina and the years of terror would scar Russia for generations to come. Moving on to some other notably eccentric rulers, let's take a look at Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. Rudolf was a great patron of the arts and sciences, amassing an enormous collection of curiosities and treasures in his castle in Prague. But Rudolf was also a deeply troubled man, intensely private and reclusive. He increasingly withdrew from the day-to-day business of ruling, preferring to spend his days among his collections. He suffered from bouts of severe depression and melancholy, and grew fixated on the occult, alchemy, and astrology. Most curiously, Rudolf became convinced that he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He took to wearing thick layers of padding under his clothes to protect his delicate glass body. Servants were ordered to whisper in the emperor's presence, lest their voices cause him to break. Rudolf's mental state continued to deteriorate in his later years. He flew into rages, talked to himself, and became increasingly paranoid. His behavior alienated his family and court, allowing his power to ebb away to his more able relatives. When Rudolf died in 1612, he left the empire in a state of crisis and upheaval. Across the continent, in the Byzantine Empire, another ruler was grappling with madness in the 6th century A.D. Justin II, who ruled from 565 to 578, was, by all accounts, a promising ruler at first, a skilled diplomat who secured peace with the Persians. But a few years into his reign, Justin's behavior took a bizarre turn. He began acting irrationally, not recognizing old friends and flying into wild rages. He alternately laughed and wept uncontrollably. He even took to barking like a dog during audiences, biting his attendants as they tried to restrain him. As Justin slipped deeper into insanity, the empire fell into disarray. The government ground to a halt, the army went unpaid, and the Avars and Slavs threatened the frontiers. Eventually, Justin's wife, Sophia, conspired with the ailing emperor's friend, Tiberius, to push Justin aside, ruling as his regent until his death in 578. Later, in 17th century Spain, the final Habsburg ruler Charles II earned the unflattering moniker the Bewitched. Born in 1661, Charles was the unfortunate product of generations of inbreeding among the Spanish Habsburgs, who sought to keep their bloodline pure. As a result, Charles suffered a litany of physical and developmental disabilities. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 or speak fully until 10. His tongue was so large, he struggled to chew and speak. He suffered digestive problems and epileptic fits. Most tellingly, his Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he couldn't fully close his mouth. Charles's disabilities left him unable to rule effectively. He was a puppet for competing court factions, manipulated by those around him. When asked who should succeed him as his health failed, he allegedly replied, "I don't know. I'm only a fool." When Charles II died childless in 1700, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. The question of his succession would spark a major European conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession. His death marked the end of an era for a dynasty plagued by the ill effects of inbreeding. As we've explored these stories of mad monarchs through the ages, a few themes emerge. The immense stress and pressure of ruling, often from a young age, took a toll on the mental health of many kings. In an age before mental illness was well understood, their erratic behavior could have devastating consequences for their realms. Their stories also highlight the importance medieval rulers placed on having a competent male heir. Without a clear line of succession, instability and power struggles often followed, as we saw with Charles the Mad's France or Henry VI's England. Looking back with modern eyes, it's hard not to feel some sympathy for these tragic figures, grappling with inner demons in a very public role. While some, like Ivan the Terrible, use their power to lash out cruelly, others, like Justin II and Charles II, come across as sad cases, powerless against their afflictions. In the end, perhaps these mad monarchs are a reminder of the very human frailties of even the most powerful rulers. For all their wealth and status, kings were not immune to the same mental and physical illnesses that could strike down any medieval man or woman. As we finish our journey through these strange chapters of medieval history, I hope these stories of mad kings and ill-fated reigns have been an intriguing peek into the complex lives of rulers past, with just enough drama to keep you from nodding off completely. And with that, our tour of eccentric sovereigns and medieval madness has reached its end. If you've enjoyed this bedtime foray into the annals of history, perhaps you'll join me again sometime. Please do like or subscribe if you'd care to hear more quirky tales of bygone days and long-dead kings, or if my droning on has proven a reliably soporific tonic. But for now, as the medieval world fades into the mists of dreams, I bid you good night and wish you a mercifully more peaceful and stable slumber than our poor mad monarchs. Sweet dreams.